Mike Long walked into a supply depot in Saigon looking for motor oil and ended up solving a problem that had been plaguing Vietnamese artillery units for 2 years. And the whole thing happened because nobody thought to ask a simple question. That's the kind of story that doesn't make it into the history books, but it tells you more about what the Vietnam War was actually like for the men who served there than a lot of the big battle narratives ever could. It's a story about communication, about bureaucracy, about the weird little details that could make or break an entire operation, and about how sometimes the most valuable thing an American advisor could do wasn't fire a weapon or call in an airstrike, but just figure out what people actually needed and get it to them. Mike Long was a captain in the United States Army Artillery, server as an advisor to Vietnamese forces in the mid-1960s. Now, to understand what that job actually meant, you have to understand how the American advisory effort in Vietnam worked. And that means going back a bit and looking at the whole structure of the war during that period. Before the big American troop buildup that most people think of when they imagine Vietnam, before the major combat operations and the search and destroy missions and all of that, there was a different phase of American involvement. It was called the advisory period, and it started way back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. During that time, the United States wasn't sending large combat units to fight the war directly. Instead, they were sending advisors, military professionals whose job was to train, equip, and support the South Vietnamese armed forces so that the South Vietnamese could fight the war themselves. The idea was that American expertise and American equipment, combined with South Vietnamese manpower and knowledge of the local terrain, would be enough to defeat the communist insurgency without requiring a massive American ground commitment. That theory didn't work out in the long run, obviously, which is why by 1965 and 1966, you had hundreds of thousands of American combat troops pouring into the country. But even after the big buildup started, the advisory mission continued. American officers and NCOs were still embedded with South Vietnamese units, still trying to help them become more effective, still dealing with all the challenges that came with working across language barriers and cultural differences and bureaucratic nightmares. Mike Long was one of those advisors. He served in what was called Third Corps, which was one of the 4 core tactical zones that South Vietnam was divided into for military purposes. The way the country was carved up, First Corps was the northernmost zone, right up against the border with North Vietnam, the narrow neck of the country where some of the heaviest fighting of the war took place. Second Corps was the Central Highlands, mountainous terrain, home to some of the most brutal battles involving American forces like the famous fight at Ia Drang. Third Corps was the big flat area that included Saigon, the capital, and the Saigon River that ran through it. And Fourth Corps was the Mekong Delta, all water and muck and rice paddies, a completely different kind of war down there. Mike Long was glad he wasn't assigned to Fourth Corps. The Delta was its own special kind of misery. Third Corps was relatively flat, which made certain things easier, but it had its own challenges. As an artillery advisor, Mike Long's job was to work with Vietnamese artillery units, helping them maintain their equipment, improve their tactics, and coordinate with American forces when necessary. His guns, meaning the howitzers he was responsible for advising on, were spread out across 4 or 5 special forces camps at any given time, plus a couple of district headquarters. Each of those positions would typically be commanded by a warrant officer or a second lieutenant, with a couple of guns and maybe 20 to 25 men. They were satellited out, scattered across the countryside, which meant that Mike Long spent a lot of his time traveling from camp to camp, checking on his people, seeing what they needed, trying to solve problems. Now, there's a detail about Mike Long's arrival in Vietnam that's worth mentioning, because it says something about the nature of military service and the little accidents of timing that can shape how people see you. Mike Long made captain before he got to Vietnam. He was a brand new captain, freshly promoted. But by the time he actually arrived in country and started meeting people, that's what he was, a captain. Nobody in Vietnam ever saw him as a first lieutenant. That might not sound like a big deal, but rank matters in the military. And there's a difference in how people treat you, how much authority you're assumed to have when you're a captain versus when you're a lieutenant. Mike Long got to start his tour with that extra bit of credibility, even though he was just as green as any other new arrival. There's another detail that Mike Long has shared about those early days that's almost too good to be true. But apparently it is true, and it shows the kind of cultural encounters that happened all the time between Americans and Vietnamese. Mike Long's last name is Long. In English, that's just a common surname, nothing special about it. But in Vietnamese, the word Long, if it's pronounced a certain way, means dragon. And to the Vietnamese soldiers Mike Long was working with, it seemed remarkable, almost magical, that this American officer had apparently changed his name to Captain Dragon just to come work with them. Mike Long tried to explain that no, that's not what his name meant. That's just what his family was called. But the Vietnamese weren't entirely convinced. They found the coincidence too perfect. And there was apparently another meaning of the word that the Vietnamese were curious about, which led to an amusing situation during Mike Long's first couple weeks in country. He said that every time he got in the shower, there would be Vietnamese soldiers peeking in to see if the name was accurate in other ways. The myth was dispelled pretty quickly, Mike Long has said, and you can hear the humor in his voice when he tells that story. It's the kind of thing that could only happen in a war zone, where different cultures are thrown together in close quarters and everybody's trying to figure each other out. But the real story, the one that Mike Long tells when he wants to make a point about what advisory work was actually like, is the story of the motor oil. It started when Mike Long was making his rounds, visiting those special forces camps where his artillery pieces were stationed. At each camp, the Vietnamese officers and the American platoon leaders would give him a list of things they needed, supplies and equipment and spare parts, the kind of stuff that any military unit needs to keep functioning. Mike Long would write it all down, being conscientious about it, and then he'd go back and try to get the stuff through the supply system. That was a big part of his job, really, making sure his people had what they needed to do their work. Well, at the first camp Mike Long visited, they asked him for motor oil. Specifically, they wanted number 4 or number 5 motor oil, the thinnest stuff, the lowest viscosity. Mike Long wrote it down. At the next camp, same thing. They wanted thin motor oil. And the next camp, and the next. By the time Mike Long had visited all 4 or 5 of his camps, every single one of them had asked for the same thing: thin motor oil. A lot of it. Now, Mike Long is a smart guy, and this struck him as strange. Why would all these camps need so much motor oil? The obvious answer would be that they had a lot of vehicles that needed oil changes. But that didn't add up. At these special forces camps, the Vietnamese trucks, the 2.5-ton trucks that were supposed to be their transportation, were sitting up on cinder blocks. They hadn't been driven in years. The roads were bad. The security situation made travel dangerous, and the trucks had basically become permanent fixtures rather than working vehicles. So what were the Vietnamese doing with all this motor oil? Mike Long didn't know, but he figured he'd find out eventually. First, he had to get the stuff. So Mike Long got in a Jeep and drove to Saigon, to one of the big resupply areas where you could requisition just about anything the American military had in country. And here's another thing about Vietnam in 1966 that Mike Long has talked about, something that gives you a sense of how chaotic and improvisational the whole logistics system was. If you had a clipboard and you looked official, you could get almost anything. You'd walk in, some sergeant would come up and say, "Can I help you, Captain?" And you'd say, "I need 27 cases of plywood." And the sergeant would say, "Yes, sir." And you'd walk out with 27 cases of plywood. Then you could trade that plywood for a generator and use the generator to provide electricity for Vietnamese dependents who didn't have any electricity, or for whatever else needed doing. It was a barter economy running alongside the official supply system, and if you knew how to work it, you could solve a lot of problems that would have been impossible to solve through proper channels. Mike Long wasn't looking to trade anything on this trip, though. He just wanted motor oil. He walked into the supply area and told them what he needed, and the supply sergeant looked at him and said, "What in the world are these Vietnamese doing with all this motor oil?" Mike Long said he didn't know. The sergeant said, "Well, sir, I'll tell you. They've gone through all of it. We don't have any. None." The Vietnamese had been requisitioning so much thin motor oil that the supply depot was completely out. This was a problem. Mike Long had promised his camps he'd get them what they needed, and now he was being told it didn't exist. So he flew back out to the field, went straight to one of his camps, and asked the question he probably should have asked from the beginning. "Why do you need this motor oil? Your trucks are sitting on cinder blocks. They haven't moved in years." And the Vietnamese explained, they weren't using the motor oil for trucks. They were using it to clean the bores of their howitzers. Now, if you know anything about artillery, you know that keeping the gun tubes clean is essential. Every time you fire a round, residue builds up inside the barrel. Carbon, copper fouling, all kinds of crud that can affect accuracy and eventually damage the weapon if you don't clean it out. There are specific products designed for this purpose, chemicals called bore cleaners, that are formulated to dissolve the fouling and protect the metal. Every artillery unit is supposed to have bore cleaner as part of their basic supplies, but the Vietnamese didn't have bore cleaner. They had been told 2 years earlier by an American advisor that there was no bore cleaner available. Use motor oil instead. So that's what they'd been doing for 2 years. Every Vietnamese artillery unit that Mike Long was advising had been cleaning their howitzer bores with motor oil because some American advisor, probably well-meaning but definitely wrong, had told them that was the only option. And they just kept doing it, requisitioning more and more motor oil, never questioning whether there might be a better way. Mike Long asked the obvious question, "Why didn't you ask me for bore cleaner?" And the answer was simple. They'd been told there wasn't any. They didn't know to ask for something they'd been told didn't exist. Mike Long drove back to that supply depot in Saigon. He walked in and said, "How about bore cleaner?" And the supply sergeant's reaction was something Mike Long has never forgotten. The sergeant said, "Oh my God, Captain, look at that corner." Mike Long looked where the sergeant was pointing, and there in the corner of the depot were 8,000 cases of bore cleaner, stacked up 20 feet high, rotting. The cases had been sitting there so long that rain had gotten to them. The cans were rusting and spilling. The whole pile was basically falling apart from neglect. Nobody had touched it in years. The sergeant said, "You can have all you want." So Mike Long became the hero of the 51st Artillery Battalion. He delivered them the first bore cleaner they'd had in 2 years. He got all of his camps completely stocked up, made sure every gun crew had what they actually needed to maintain their weapons properly. And then, once his own people were taken care of, he let everybody else know about the miracle. He told all the other advisors, "Hey, there's a mountain of bore cleaners sitting in Saigon, go get it." Because all the other advisors had been dealing with the same problem. Their Vietnamese units had been asking for motor oil too, and nobody had thought to ask why until Mike Long did. That's the story. It's not a story about combat or heroism in the traditional sense. Nobody got shot, nobody got a medal, Nobody did anything that would make it into a movie. But Mike Long has told this story for decades because he thinks it captures something essential about what the advisory mission in Vietnam was really like, and what military service often comes down to when you strip away all the drama. It was about solving problems. It was about communication. It was about cutting through bureaucracy and assumption and inertia to figure out what people actually needed and then getting it to them. The Vietnamese artillery units had been struggling with inadequate supplies for 2 years, not because the supplies didn't exist, but because somewhere along the line there had been a miscommunication, and then that miscommunication had hardened into accepted fact, and nobody had questioned it, until Mike Long showed up and asked a simple question. Why do you need this motor oil? That's the kind of thing that happened constantly in Vietnam, and probably happens constantly in every war, and in every large organization for that matter. Information gets garbled. Workarounds become standard procedure. People keep doing things a certain way because that's how they've always done it, even when there's a better way sitting right there in the corner, rotting. Mike Long was able to fix that particular problem because he was curious enough to ask questions and persistent enough to follow up. That's not glamorous work, but it mattered. Those bore cleaners mattered. Clean gun tubes meant more accurate fire, which meant better support for the troops on the ground, which meant lives saved. You can trace a direct line from Mike Long asking, "Why do you need motor oil?" to Vietnamese artillery being more effective, to South Vietnamese soldiers and their American advisors being better protected. That's the kind of impact that doesn't show up in the official histories, but was absolutely real for the people involved. The broader context of Mike Long's service is worth understanding too. He served multiple tours in Vietnam, with his second tour in the early 1970s in 2nd Corps, the Central Highlands. A lot of the men he served with went back even further, some of them to 1962 or 1963, the very early days of American involvement when there were only a few thousand advisors in the whole country. These were the guys who were there before the big buildup, who watched the war escalate from a small advisory effort to a massive American commitment, and who often felt that the lessons they'd learned in the early days were ignored or forgotten as the war got bigger and more bureaucratic. The advisory role was always a strange position to be in. You were there to help and support, but you weren't in command. You could advise, but you couldn't order. You were dependent on building relationships with your Vietnamese counterparts, earning their trust, understanding their needs, working within their system, while also trying to connect them to American resources and capabilities. It required a different set of skills than leading American troops in combat. It required patience, cultural sensitivity, linguistic ability, or at least a willingness to work through interpreters, and a certain humility about the limits of what you could accomplish. Mike Long seems to have had those qualities. The story about the motor oil shows someone who was paying attention, who was curious about the details, who didn't just go through the motions of filing requisitions, but actually wanted to understand what was happening on the ground. That's the kind of advisor who could make a difference. The Special Forces camps where Mike Long's artillery was stationed were interesting places in their own right. The Special Forces, the Green Berets, had been in Vietnam since the early 1960s, running programs to train and arm local defense forces, particularly among the Montagnard tribal people in the highlands and other minority groups who had their own reasons for opposing the communists. These camps were often in remote locations, surrounded by hostile territory, dependent on air resupply and their own resourcefulness to survive. Having artillery at a Special Forces camp was a significant asset. The howitzers could provide fire support for the camp's defenses and for operations in the surrounding area. But artillery requires maintenance, requires supplies, requires expertise to employ effectively. That's where advisors like Mike Long came in. They were the link between the Vietnamese gun crews and the American logistics system, the people who could make sure the guns had ammunition and spare parts and, yes, bore cleaner. The period when Mike Long was serving in 3rd Corps, around 1966, was a transitional time in the war. The advisory phase was ending, and the combat phase was well underway. American units were conducting major operations throughout the country, and the nature of American involvement had fundamentally changed. But the advisory mission continued alongside the combat mission, sometimes overlapping, sometimes running in parallel. American advisors were still working with Vietnamese units, even as American battalions were fighting their own battles nearby. It was a complicated situation, and the relationship between American and Vietnamese forces was often strained by different priorities, different capabilities, and different understandings of what the war was about. Mike Long's story about the motor oil is funny in a way. There's something almost absurd about 8,000 cases of bore cleaners sitting forgotten in a corner while Vietnamese artillery crews struggled with motor oil. It's the kind of dark comedy that soldiers appreciate, the recognition that war is often more snafu than glory, more paperwork than heroism. But there's also something serious underneath the humor. The Vietnamese artillerymen were doing their best with what they had. They'd been told there was no bore cleaner, so they improvised with motor oil. It wasn't ideal, but they made it work. That kind of adaptability is a form of courage, too. The willingness to keep going, keep doing your job, even when the system isn't giving you what you need. And the American advisor who originally told them to use motor oil probably wasn't being malicious or lazy. He probably checked on bore cleaner, was told there wasn't any available, and came up with the best alternative he could think of. The problem was that his temporary solution became permanent, and nobody ever went back to check whether the original problem had been fixed. That's how institutions fail. Not through dramatic betrayals or obvious incompetence, but through small assumptions that calcify into policy. Through workarounds that become standard operating procedure. Through questions that don't get asked because everyone assumes someone else already asked them. Mike Long broke that cycle by being willing to look stupid, in a sense. He could have just requisitioned the motor oil, delivered it to his camps, and checked the box. Job done. But instead, he asked why, and that simple question unraveled the whole mess. The story also illustrates something about the supply system in Vietnam, which was both incredibly abundant and incredibly dysfunctional. The United States military poured an enormous amount of material into South Vietnam, more than any army in history had ever deployed to a single theater of war. There was stuff everywhere: equipment, ammunition, food, medicine, construction materials, vehicles, everything you could imagine. But getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time was a constant struggle. The logistics system was overwhelmed by the scale of the operation, and things fell through the cracks constantly. 8,000 cases of bore cleaner rotting in a depot, while artillery units cleaned their guns with motor oil, is a perfect symbol of that dysfunction. The supplies existed, the need existed, but the connection between them was broken, and it took a curious captain with a clipboard to fix it. Mike Long's willingness to drive to Saigon, to ask questions at the supply depot, to go back to his camps and dig deeper when the first answers didn't make sense, that's what made the difference. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was effective. And effectiveness, in the end, is what matters most in war. You can have all the courage in the world, but if you can't get the supplies you need, if you can't maintain your equipment, if you can't communicate with your allies, you're going to lose. The boring stuff, the logistics and administration and problem solving, that's often what determines who wins and who loses. Mike Long understood that, and he was good at it. The cultural dynamics that Mike Long navigated were also significant. Working with Vietnamese forces meant working across a language barrier, obviously, but also across differences in military culture, organizational structure, and basic assumptions about how things should be done. The Vietnamese had their own ways of doing things, developed over years of fighting first the French and then the communist insurgency. They weren't always eager to adopt American methods, and they had their own reasons for the choices they made. A good advisor had to respect that, had to understand that his counterparts weren't ignorant or incompetent just because they did things differently. Mike Long seems to have approached his Vietnamese colleagues with that kind of respect. When he tells the motor oil story, he's not making fun of the Vietnamese for using the wrong product to clean their guns. He's pointing out that the system failed them, that an American advisor gave them bad information. And then the supply chain didn't give them any way to correct that error. The Vietnamese were doing the best they could with the information and resources they had. The failure was on the American side, and Mike Long was the American who finally fixed it. There's a lesson there that applies well beyond Vietnam, well beyond the military even. When things aren't working the way they should, it's easy to blame the people at the bottom, the ones who are actually doing the work. They're using the wrong product. They're following the wrong procedure. They don't know what they're doing. But often, if you dig a little deeper, you find that the real problem is higher up. Bad information, broken systems, resources that exist but aren't getting to where they're needed. The people on the ground are usually doing the best they can with what they've got. The job of leadership is to make sure they've got the right stuff. Mike Long took that responsibility seriously. He didn't just pass along requisitions and hope for the best. He followed up. He asked questions. He drove to Saigon. He poked around in supply depots. And when he found the answer, he didn't just solve the problem for his own units. He spread the word so that everyone could benefit. That's good leadership. That's the kind of officer that enlisted men remember fondly decades later. Not because he led them in some dramatic charge, but because he made sure they had bore cleaner and dry socks, and the 100 other small things that make the difference between a unit that functions and a unit that falls apart. The physical environment that Mike Long was operating in deserves some attention too. 3rd Corps, where he was stationed, was different from the other Corps tactical zones in important ways. It was relatively flat, as Mike Long has noted, which made movement easier in some ways but also made concealment harder. The Saigon River ran through the area, and the capital city of Saigon was the political and economic heart of the country. Control of 3rd Corps mattered enormously, because control of Saigon mattered enormously. The enemy knew this, and they focused significant effort on the area, including the famous Tet Offensive of 1968, when Communist forces attacked Saigon itself and dozens of other cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. Mike Long's service in 3rd Corps in 1966 came before Tet, during a period when the American buildup was still underway and the ultimate trajectory of the war was still uncertain. Nobody knew then how things would turn out. The advisors, like Mike Long, were working on the assumption that if they could just get the South Vietnamese forces strong enough, capable enough, well supplied enough, those forces could eventually take over the fight and the Americans could go home. That assumption turned out to be wrong, or at least much more complicated than anyone anticipated. But at the time, it seemed like a reasonable hope, and the work that advisors like Mike Long were doing was seen as essential to making it happen. Every howitzer that worked properly, every gun crew that could put accurate fire on a target, every small improvement in the capability of South Vietnamese forces, it all mattered. At least, that was the theory. The reality was messier, as it always is in war. Mike Long's second tour in Vietnam, in Second Corps during the early 1970s, came during a very different phase of the war. By then, the American withdrawal was underway. Troop levels were declining. The policy called Vietnamization was supposed to transfer responsibility for the fighting to the South Vietnamese, which was basically what the advisory mission had always been about, just on a much larger scale and under much more desperate circumstances. The men who served during that period, in the early 1970s, often felt forgotten. The American public had largely turned against the war. The protests at home were constant, and the soldiers and advisors who were still in country were trying to do their jobs while knowing that their country had already decided to leave. It's a strange position to be in, fighting a war that your own nation has given up on. Mike Long and the men he served with during that period have stories of their own, different from the stories of the earlier years but no less significant. The advisory mission in Vietnam produced thousands of men like Mike Long, officers and NCOs who spent their tours working alongside Vietnamese forces, trying to make a difference in ways that often went unrecognized and unappreciated. Some of them did heroic things under fire. Some of them did heroic things with clipboards and requisition forms. Most of them just did their jobs as best they could, day after day, in a war that was confusing and frustrating and sometimes seemingly pointless. The motor oil story is a small story in the grand scheme of things. It didn't change the course of the war, it didn't make the newspapers, nobody got a medal for it. But it mattered to the Vietnamese artillerymen who finally got proper bore cleaner for the first time in 2 years. It mattered to the advisors in other units who learned about the supply and were able to fix the same problem for their own people. And it matters as an illustration of what the war was actually like for so many of the men who served there. Not constant combat, not Hollywood heroics, but the daily grind of trying to make things work in a system that often seemed designed to prevent anything from working at all. Mike Long figured out the motor oil mystery because he was paying attention and because he was willing to ask questions that might have seemed obvious or stupid. That's a rare quality, actually. Most people, in most situations, just go along with the way things are done. They don't ask why. They don't dig deeper when the first answer doesn't make sense. They accept the workarounds and the inefficiencies and the "we've always done it this way" explanations. Mike Long didn't do that, at least not in this case. And the result was a small victory against the forces of institutional dysfunction. The broader lessons of the Vietnam War are still debated today, more than 50 years after the last American troops came home. People argue about whether the war was necessary, whether it was winnable, whether the strategies employed were right or wrong, whether the sacrifices were worth it. Those are important questions, but they can sometimes obscure the individual human stories of the men and women who actually served there. Whatever you think about the war as a whole, the people who fought it deserve to have their stories told. Mike Long's story is one of those stories. It's a story about a young captain trying to do his job in a complicated situation, about the challenges of working across cultures and through bureaucracies, about the small victories that don't make the history books, but that mattered enormously to the people involved. It's a story about 8,000 cases of bore cleaners sitting in a corner, and about the man who finally asked the right question to get them moving to where they needed to be. When you hear stories like this, stories from veterans who were there and who remember the details that don't make it into the official accounts, you get a different picture of what the war was really like. Not just the battles and the body counts and the big strategic decisions, but the daily reality of soldiers and advisors trying to make things work. The motor oil that turned out to be bore cleaner. The trucks on cinder blocks. The Vietnamese soldiers peeking into the shower to see if Captain Dragon was really a dragon. The sergeant at the supply depot who said you can have all you want. Those details matter. They're what make the history human. Mike Long has spent years since Vietnam telling his stories, sharing what he learned, connecting with other veterans who went through similar experiences. The advisory community, the men who worked with Vietnamese forces during the war, has its own networks and reunions and ways of keeping the memories alive. They know things about the war that most Americans never learned, perspectives that got lost in the larger debates about policy and strategy. Mike Long's perspective is one of those valuable viewpoints. He saw the war from a particular angle, working with Vietnamese artillerymen in special forces camps scattered across Third Corps. And what he saw was both frustrating and sometimes surprisingly hopeful. Frustrating because the systems didn't work the way they should have, because information got lost, because resources sat unused while needs went unmet. Hopeful because sometimes, when the right person asked the right question, things could get fixed. 8,000 cases of bore cleaner could finally get to the men who needed them. That's a small hope, maybe, but it's something. And in a war that often seemed hopeless, the small hopes were what kept people going. The men Mike Long served with, both American and Vietnamese, were doing their best in difficult circumstances. They deserved someone who would fight the bureaucracy on their behalf, who would drive to Saigon and poke around in supply depots and ask the questions that needed to be asked. Mike Long was that someone, at least in this one instance, and the story has stuck with him for decades because it captures something true about what the experience was like. Stories like this don't always get told the right way, if they get told at all. The Vietnam War produced millions of veterans with millions of stories, and most of those stories have never been recorded. The men who served are getting older now, and every year more of them pass away, taking their memories with them. That's why it matters to listen when they're willing to talk, to capture the details while they're still available, to honor the service of men like Mike Long, not just with ceremonies and monuments, but with attention to the actual texture of what they experienced. Mike Long went to Vietnam as a young artillery officer. He served his country in a war that was controversial and difficult, and ultimately unsuccessful in its stated objectives. But he did his job. He took care of his people. He solved problems that needed to be solved. And he came home with stories that are still worth telling more than half a century later. The motor oil story is one of those stories. It's not about heroism in the conventional sense. It's about competence, about curiosity, about the willingness to dig beneath the surface and figure out what's really going on. It's about the small things that make a big difference, the unglamorous work that keeps militaries functioning, the kind of service that doesn't earn medals but that matters just as much as anything that happens in combat. However you look at it, what Mike Long and the other advisors did in Vietnam mattered. It mattered to the Vietnamese soldiers they worked with. It mattered to the overall effort, even if that effort ultimately fell short. And it still matters today, as a reminder that service takes many forms, that not all heroes carry rifles, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is ask a simple question that nobody else thought to ask. Mike Long asked that question. He found the bore cleaner. He got it to the men who needed it. And that's a story worth remembering, even if it's not the kind of story that makes it into the movies. That's just how it was over there. You did what you could. You solved the problems in front of you. And you hoped it made a difference. Mike Long made a difference. And he's still telling the story, all these years later, because he wants people to understand what it was really like, not the Hollywood version, but the real thing, bore cleaner and motor oil and all.